Good evening. I'm your host, Tiffany Meyer. Deja vu. That's what many are reporting feeling following the news coming out of China. The virus is currently wreaking havoc across the country. That's after the loosening of the draconian zero COVID-19 policies following the protests that sparked across the country. Now, reports of new variants. The Financial Times reporting over 250 million Chinese seem to be infected with the virus. And while the Chinese regime has recategorized what counts as a COVID death, droves of Chinese Communist Party elite have been dying lately. From former party officials to stars who towed the party line. Now, why is that? But while chaos unfolds inside China, now the rest of the world is on high alert. That's because China's opening up its borders. Is the world about to see another wave of COVID-19? Instead of entering 2023, are we instead going back to 2020? Countries like the U.S. are requiring a negative COVID-19 test from anyone from China wanting to enter the country. Milan, meanwhile, testing those who just arrived from China, finding out that half of the passengers tested positive for the virus. Scientists in Italy are already working on piecing together the latest virus genome sequence. That's to check for possible new variants. And depending on those findings, the country might impose stricter rules. And all of this while the Chinese regime remains tight-lipped. The lack of transparency dredging up memories of 2020. But before fear takes hold and grows once again around the world, a look at the differences. What's behind this spike in cases across China? If Omicron is behind the latest variants, why is it so lethal in China but not elsewhere? Experts speculating it comes down to the ineffectiveness of Chinese homegrown vaccines, expounded by the lack of immunity caused by the rolling lockdowns. Either way, reports of hospitals and funeral homes overwhelmed in China, all while officials stopped testing for the virus. And as we're left with more questions than answers, joining us now to help shed light on all of this is former U.S. Army microbiologist and professor of biomedical sciences at Feitian College, Dr. Sean Lin. He's also a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. Sean, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Tiffany, thank you for inviting me to your program.
So China's announcement of letting Chinese people go abroad starting January 8th has sent shockwaves around the world, triggering memories of 2020. So what can we expect this time? Is it the same?
I don't think it will be the same as 2020. I think this time it probably will be much worse. To put it in the narrative, I call it, it's like a collapse of the three gorge dams in the public health domain. And so it will be like big tsunamis of these waves of infection in China. And probably it's more than just Omicron variant. And I think the whole world right now in this winter season definitely see at least a tripledemic. And so you've got a flu season as well as respiratory syncytial virus and plus the Omicron variants. So at least three pathogens are at high peak at this season. And then in China, I think the issue is not just about how many people get infected. The core issue is how many people got hospitalized, how many people are in ICU, and how many people die. And so these are the three most important numbers that the Chinese Communist Party try to hide right now. They can leak some official document, talk about over 260 million people got infected in the next 2 weeks. But I think they still gonna hide the real most critical number, the death toll.
And on that note, despite all of the lack of transparency, what do we know so far about those who have been dying?
The symptoms definitely is very surprising to many public health people because right now we know that the original strain, the Wuhan strain as well as Delta strain, pretty much already no longer circulating in the whole world except in China. And right now, the China actually saying they identify Delta strain sequence in certain city, but we haven't seen the sequence. And right now, actually, the most updated sequencing information actually was provided by two provisional CDC in China, the Fujian and Sichuan province. But what they identified is not some new variant that the world have not seen. And the Japanese public health agencies announced today, actually they identified CM.2 variants, but this variant has also been identified in the past, and it was circulating earlier a few months in the United States too, and nobody see a very severe respiratory disease. But in China, so many people got a severe infection in the lung, not just in the upper respiratory tract. So this is totally different. So I don't think it's just due to the Omicron variant. So the situation may be much worse, and also I think it's related to the overall respiratory disease burdens in China, or pulmonary disease burden in China. In China, we know even the COPD, the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in China, there are over 100 million people have COPD. So especially in the north of China, many people have this problem due to heavy smoke as well as severe environmental pollutions. And so many people already have poor lung health conditions. So right now, when you have multiple pathogens circulating in China, many people will have severe symptoms. And if the anti-pyretic medicine is in severe shortage, so many people probably cannot overcome the fever as well as the disease progression. So the death toll, I believe, will be very high. So this is one situation totally different from 2020.
And on that note, as for these new variants or even mutations, it seems Chinese authorities have said they detected 130 sublineages of COVID-19 in China. What does that even mean?
That doesn't mean much, actually, because in the global COVID sequence database like GSET, you can identify over 450 different subvariants of Omicron. So China said they identify 150 subvariants, but China has been providing very limited sequencing data since the summer of 2020. So far, United States provide more than 4 million of sequencing data, and China only provided thousands of these sequencing data. So can you really trust what the Chinese government said about the sequencing data? I doubt it. And I actually think right now many countries like Japan, Italian start to screening Chinese passengers into these countries, and using their sample to get the sequencing data. I think it's much more reliable, and there's probably no hope to see the Chinese government become transparent on this aspect. And so I think it's we probably see more new discoveries in the coming weeks when the more countries testing the samples from Chinese passengers.
And on that note, with especially many Chinese leaving the country, what can the rest of the world do to really protect against maybe these new variants?
I think as the Japanese government has been doing is to testing the passengers from China as well, putting people in 7 days quarantine if they tested positive for COVID. I think this is essential, and I probably hope that more countries were doing it, especially some of the neighboring countries, when more Chinese passengers will try to escape from China. In the past 3 years, hard lockdown in China under the zero COVID policies has taken away many people's livelihood in China. Many people, cannot sustain their life in China in this way, and many people who still have resource to manage maybe to leave China. If they already have passport, if they have the financial source, they will try very hard to leave China. So I think will be a lot of Chinese people want to leave China with this narrow window open right now. So I think the global society definitely need to pay a severe attention on this, serious attention on these issues, because many people will carry the pathogens to different countries, and the different countries definitely need to prepare if more transmissible variant emerge from China and then got spread widely in other countries, and then bring another wave of COVID in other countries. I hope there's no more pathogenic strains emerge, but I think the likelihood right now is much higher than before. When the virus already spread out so widely with hundreds of millions of people got infected, the next thing the virus do is not just to enhance transmissibility, it's likely it will enhance its pathogenicity, especially in China. So many people have poor immune situations under the COVID, under chronic disease conditions. So I think the virus has higher chance of to create mutations that lead to higher pathogenicity. So I think there's a huge concern now.
Dr. Sean Lin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And coming up after the break, we are joined by Jenna Ellis. She's here to discuss the latest with Title 42 and the unlikely team of Justices Gorsuch and Jackson, who issued a scathing dissent. Join us after the break to hear what they had to say and for Jenna's analysis.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you are in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit. At NTD Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. NTD Business. I'm Paul Green.
The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back. Let's turn to our own border. Title 42 will remain in place, at least for the time being. That's the latest from the Supreme Court, which on Tuesday voted 5-4 in favor of the 19 Republican state attorney generals who brought the suit. But in an interesting twist, Trump appointed Neil Gorsuch and Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson voted against keeping Title 42 in place. And in the dissent, written by Gorsuch and joined by Jackson, issued a scathing rebuke to the states, Congress, and even President Biden. Specifically, in the dissent, the two justices agreed that Congress and the Biden administration have failed to address the immigration crisis and left the states with valid concerns. But Gorsuch followed that acknowledgement by arguing that the current border crisis is not a COVID crisis. He said, and I quote, "Courts should not be in the business of perpetuating administrative edicts designed for one emergency only because elected officials have failed to address a different emergency. We are a court of law, not policymakers of last resort." Joining us now to discuss is Epoch Times contributor and former senior advisor and counsel to President Donald Trump, Jenna Ellis. Jenna, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Great to join you today. Thanks.
Gorsuch and Jackson, it seems like an unlikely team, but a team they are. And they came out swinging against the majority ruling. What do you think about their argument that states are asking the Supreme Court to act like a legislative body?
I think that Gorsuch's dissent was absolutely correct. There are a court of law, not policymakers. And so even though we have a context here where the COVID-19 pandemic pretext is benefiting conservatives because, of course, we advocate for a closed border and for immediate expulsion of illegal immigrants that haven't gone through the legal process, the COVID pretext shouldn't be used as border policy when it really is just a pretext. And that's what Gorsuch and, interestingly, Justice Jackson are getting at, that one solution that was designed to address a different emergency should never be used as a pretext to address something completely different that lawmakers have failed to address. So in this instance, I think he's correct, even though the Supreme Court has simply said that they are going to wait until fuller and more robust arguments can be presented in February, which is not atypical for the courts to do.
And Jenna, now looking at the legality of the state's challenge to keep Title 42, the federal government implemented this policy. Shouldn't it then logically have the right to remove it? Why or why not?
Right, and so the 19 Republican states that are bringing this suit have an issue with the border. That is a legitimate issue. That's something that, for example, Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, is strongly arguing. And typically I agree with him. But here I think it's going to be difficult for the Republican states to mount a legal challenge because, as Gorsuch also discussed in his dissent, an edict or an executive order from one administration really shouldn't bind the next when, of course, the underlying issue is no longer a valid legal basis to keep that particular order in place. And so here, the Biden administration, while we as conservatives don't like the border policy, really should be addressed by Congress. It should be addressed by the governors of the states that under the Constitution in Article 1, Section 10 can enact and say that they can control their own borders. Things like that are better solutions than keeping a COVID pretext in place.
On that note, really quickly, what are your thoughts on using COVID-19 as a justification for keeping Title 42 in place?
If conservatives are consistent, then we will be against that. We will be against it for the same reason that we have said the pandemic is over, and so schools should be open, churches should be open, there should be no more mandates. COVID should not be a pretext, just like any other legal mechanism that is a pretext designed for an outcome-driven solution rather than a legal-based solution. So conservatives in this instance, maybe we like the outcome, but if it's not the correct application and use of the law, we need to go for precedent, for consistency, and for the constitutionally correct solutions over simply outcome-based resolution.
And Jenna, is there anything SCOTUS can or should do about the border crisis in this case?
Well, they need to protect and preserve the Constitution, and if Republican-led states, for example, declare an invasion under the Constitution, they need to protect the constitutional right of governors to exercise that power. But the Supreme Court in and of itself, as Justice Gorsuch and Jackson said, are not policymakers. So really this falls on Congress, and they should, by a bipartisan majority, say there is a border crisis and they need to come up with a solution. This is a legislative remedy, not a judicial activist solution.
Jenna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Dr. Scott Atlas. He's here to discuss the latest Twitter files revelations, including that Twitter censored doctors and health experts. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back. Christmas might be over, but Elon Musk is still handing out gifts. His latest gift to mankind, confirming that all the conspiracy theories about Twitter are true. In fact, in an interview posted to Twitter, Elon said that the conspiracy theories are even more true than people thought.
I mean, to be totally frank, almost every conspiracy theory that people had about Twitter turned out to be true. Is there a conspiracy theory about Twitter that didn't turn out to be true? So far, they've all turned out to be true, and if not, more true than people thought.
For example, Twitter suppressing conservatives, true. Twitter working with the FBI and DOJ, true. Twitter hiding COVID information from doctors and experts because it didn't fit the CDC's narrative, also true. According to the latest Twitter files drop, it seems Elon believes the above was bad enough to warrant a new Twitter policy. Today, he tweeted that the new policy is to follow the science, which necessarily includes reasoned questioning of the science. Now, the latest bombshell seems to indicate that not only did the Biden administration pressure Twitter to censor information, but so too the Trump administration. Joining us to discuss these latest revelations is Epoch Times contributor and senior fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford, Dr. Scott Atlas. Dr. Atlas was also a special advisor and member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force under President Trump. Dr. Atlas, thanks for joining us. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
To begin, you worked for President Trump as a White House Coronavirus Task Force member, and we're hearing now that at the start of the pandemic, Trump was worried about panic buying and behaviors, among other things. Did you know about Trump asking Twitter to help with a specific narrative, and what do you think about this revelation?
No, I didn't. In fact, I wasn't there at the beginning. I only got there to start August 2020 and stayed for 3 months after that. But nothing surprises me about censorship because this was obvious. From when I was in the White House, I was advisor to the president, and Twitter took down my tweet and suspended my Twitter account because, I tweeted quotes about the data on the masks. And the reality is that the American public needs to know the information. We're supposed to live in a free country. People are necessarily, it's necessary to hear the information. There is no such thing as science and arriving at the truths that we need without hearing the scientific debate. And particularly so when you're in a crisis, when information is needed, by everyone. And, the reality is that particularly the advisor to the president during a healthcare crisis, if some third party thinks that the American public doesn't need to hear what the advisor to the president is saying, I think there's something seriously wrong. And thankfully, we have somebody in charge at Twitter now who recognizes the value of free speech.
And now the Trump administration wasn't alone in working with Twitter. The Biden administration seems to have taken that coordination up a notch. In fact, according to the latest Twitter files drop, Twitter suppressed COVID information that fell outside the CDC's guidelines. Do you think pandemic censorship impacted people's health decisions? And if so, could that have resulted in a loss of life?
Well, absolutely. There's no question. Censorship and stopping information usually is some sort of a hypothetical with some vague implications. When you're talking about censoring medical science and health policy, you are killing people. Censorship of the correct science and medical information during this pandemic absolutely killed people. It prevented people from making intelligent decisions. It prevented people from making the appropriate use of caution. This was very, very harmful. In fact, shocking that in a country that seems to be founded on freedom, we had such a thing going on. This kind of censorship was, in my view, unheard of in the United States. And it's reminiscent of everything that we as a free society and democracy abhor about countries that are authoritarian like China, the former USSR and now Russia, North Korea. This is the kind of censorship that occurs in those countries. And now it is occurring in our country. And it's not just Twitter, it's not just social media, and it's not simply blocking information. It's also sort of being less overt about it. It's limiting the public access to information. It's impugning people who are speaking correct information, and that was supported during this pandemic by university so-called experts, by public health guidance leaders like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, etc., who went to their friends in the media and undermined people like me, who in fact were saying what was correct, what has been validated as being correct this entire time. But the reality is, yes, censorship of science kills people, and it killed people during this pandemic. There's no doubt about that.
And Doctor, in the latest Rasmussen Report survey, 63% reported wanting Congress to investigate Twitter. Clearly that shows bipartisan concern and a desire for accountability. But do you think a congressional investigation is enough to get to the bottom of whatever's been happening between big tech and government?
I have my doubts. I'm very skeptical of any investigation led by government officials. Number one, government investigations are usually political in nature, and even if they aren't political, they will be perceived as having been political. And once something is perceived as political, you've lost a significant percentage of the public in terms of credibility. On the other hand, it's necessary to do the investigations because we need the public to know the truth, and investigations are one way to do that. We need the public to have the information that the people that were lying during the pandemic, the people that were wrong during the pandemic, and the people that were misleading the public during this healthcare crisis of the pandemic, this has to be public, because if it is not publicly displayed, it has a higher danger of happening again. We must have these revelations be made public. Government may be the only way we can do it, although I think third parties could do it. But and I'm doubtful it will be perceived as fair and credible, even if it is. On the other hand, we need to do it.
Dr. Scott Atlas, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thanks for having me.
And sticking with the Twitter files, coming up after the break, we are joined by Janine Eunice. Janine represents Doctors Martin Koldorf and Jay Bhattacharya in a case alleging the government violated a doctor's First Amendment rights. Hear how the latest Twitter file drop could impact the case. That and more after the break.
The lasting beauty of realistic oil painting. Brilliant, expressive, and inspirational. The 6th NTD International Figure Painting Competition. Guided by pure authenticity, beauty, and goodness. Invites you to join us on a journey back to traditional art. The Gold Award is $10,000. For more details, please visit oilpainting.ntdtv.com.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Welcome back. As Elon Musk continues to release the secret dealings between Twitter and the government via the Twitter files, we're learning more and more just how deep this rabbit hole goes. In the latest drop, we learned that Twitter specifically targeted Dr. Martin Kulldorff, a prominent epidemiologist and former Harvard School of Medicine professor. Dr. Kulldorff is also one of 3 co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. His crime? Not towing the party line regarding COVID-19 and saying that children and those with prior COVID infection don't need the vaccine. Apparently, he believes in natural immunity. Imagine that. Of course, he wasn't alone in being targeted. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a professor of medicine at Stanford University and fellow author of the Great Barrington Declaration, was throttled by Twitter too. Well, neither Kulldorff nor Bhattacharya were willing to take Twitter and the government's overreaching lying down. They joined the Missouri and Louisiana suit challenging government-directed social media censorship and hired Janine Eunice, a litigation counsel at New Civil Liberties Alliance, to represent them. And joining us to discuss this is Janine herself. Janine, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
First off, can you explain Dr. Kulldorff and Bhattacharya's case and its significance?
Yeah, so Drs. Bhattacharya and Kulldorff are claiming that they were censored on social media extensively, their ideas, and that censorship didn't happen because the social media companies wanted to do it, but because the federal government coerced and pressured the companies, threatening them with regulation or other legal consequences if they didn't censor people for spreading so-called misinformation about COVID. And of course, we know misinformation is just a term used to sort of make ideas that are different from the government seem as though they're not, they're crazy.
And in this latest Twitter files drop, we learned specifically that Twitter targeted both of your clients. So how does that revelation help your case?
That's a really good question. So it definitely is helpful. I mean, to show that our clients were specifically targeted. Judges in similar cases in the past have basically said that there wasn't enough evidence that specific individuals were censored because of the government. The companies maybe would have done this on their own. Now, I don't actually think that that's a correct interpretation of the law. I think that our clients should have been able to establish First Amendment violations regardless of whether or not they were specifically mentioned, but it definitely helps, and it helps overcome that hurdle. So in a way, this is good news for our lawsuit.
And Janine, what is your opinion of all the revelations revealed in the Twitter files? Do they count as a smoking gun potentially?
I think that the latest drop I actually would call a smoking gun. So what so far what the government has been saying is that, well, the companies want to do this. They want to be censoring people. They want to help the government. Now, again, I actually don't think that they should be able to do that. I think that's a First Amendment violation if the government and the companies are working together to censor people based on their viewpoint. The First Amendment says that the government can't censor people based on their viewpoints, and likewise, the government can't use these private companies as intermediaries to accomplish what it couldn't do directly. However, when you have coercion, it's an even stronger, clearer case. So the latest Twitter files, one of the emails was an internal email that's sort of summarizing what had happened in a meeting, and a Twitter executive said that the White House was extremely angry with Twitter for not censoring misinformation more. They didn't know what to do, and I think that's direct evidence that this censorship was happening because of the government. So I would call that a smoking gun, actually.
And the Twitter files have been largely ignored or dismissed as a nothing burger by much of the legacy media and many left-wing pundits. What do you make of all of that?
Well, it looks very bad politically for the White House. And obviously, we know a lot of left-leaning pundits are Democratic voters. They probably want Biden to win the next election, or at least a Democrat. And this looks really bad. I mean, you have the government violating people's civil liberties en masse, their First Amendment rights. That's very serious. So I think they're trying very hard to downplay it. But this is a very serious matter. I mean, we've never had government censoring the voices of Americans. Our clients are top epidemiologists whose voices were censored on the subject of their expertise. That's crazy when you look at it, but then lots of regular Americans who just had different opinions about COVID, and many of them turned out to be right, were censored. So this skewed the debate. It made it appear that there was a consensus that we should have lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, when actually many people, scientists and not scientists, were disagreeing.
And Janine, as a lawyer, do you think the revelations warrant further legal action against Twitter and the federal government?
That's a really interesting question. So my office only sues the government. We don't sue private companies. I will say, under state action theory, if the private company is sort of working as an arm of the government to accomplish these unconstitutional aims, then in my opinion, they should be able to be sued as government actors. So I think that this will actually bring forward a spate of lawsuits. And people, like Alex Berenson, people may have heard of. He was a New York Times journalist, former New York Times journalist who was suspended by Twitter at the behest of the government. He sort of has the other most direct evidence, where you have emails between Twitter employees saying that the White House was pressuring them to censor Berenson. Now, someone like him, he made some money, generated an income, he sold books that he promoted on Twitter. He might be able to sue for money damages. And so I think that you could have people like that bring forth a lot of lawsuits.
And on that note, do you think new legislation is needed to ensure that we never see a repeat of this kind of government-directed censorship again? Or do you think that existing laws and Twitter being in new hands is enough?
That's a really good question. I think it depends a little bit on how these court cases turn out. So there's the Missouri case. I actually have another case that's quite similar in the Southern District of Ohio. If courts recognize that this is a First Amendment violation, if they draw a line and say, no, the court, the government cannot work with private companies to censor Americans for expressing, again, disfavored views that are frowned upon by the government, then I think that may be enough. And, I think sometimes more regulation tends to be abused. It often can end up accomplishing the opposite of what it's supposed to. But if the courts don't protect the rights of Americans in these circumstances, then I think I would probably support legislation as the only step forward.
And very quickly at the end, what's next for your case?
So we are deposing the former White House press secretary, Jennifer Psaki, in January. We've had a number of depositions, including of Anthony Fauci. We've gotten discovery in this case, which has sort of revealed a very high level of collusion between the government and big tech. So we hope to get a ruling on our emergency preliminary injunction motion sometime in the early spring or late winter. And so that's what will be happening next.
Well, we'll be following your case very closely too. Janine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Jason Isaac, who's here to discuss the latest debacle with utility companies not having enough power, particularly during extreme weather events. As the transition to green energy continues, will our power grid be able to hold up? Find out after the break.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here.
Freedom is not free, and neither is the truth. In order to bring you the facts, our reporters are out there on the front lines getting the true story. Some of them served 10 years of prison in China. We've been censored on social media. Our Hong Kong printing offices were set on fire, and we've been repeatedly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we continue to bring the truth to light. Head on over to getepoch.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
Welcome back. Over the past week or so, many parts of the country experienced what the National Weather Service called a once-in-a-generation type event. We're talking blistering cold and deadly snowfall. But while temperatures were dropping and Americans were looking to turn up their heat, utility companies across the United States were asking customers to go cold, turn down the heat. And when that wasn't enough, they had to institute rolling blackouts. One utility company, Con Edison, which serves New York City, reported heavy demand for natural gas was creating challenges for supply. Duke Energy, which operates in several states, also cited that tight energy supplies as a challenge for weathering the storm. That all begs the question, what's going on here? Why can't the power grid handle the cold? Is it that extreme weather is getting worse, or is something else at play? Joining us to discuss this is former Texas State Representative Jason Isaac. Jason is now the director of Life Powered, an initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation dedicated to raising America's energy IQ. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
It's great to be on. Thank you.
Rolling blackouts, lack of energy supplies, utility companies urging their customers to conserve energy use. What's going on with the power grid?
Well, what's happening is a result of market manipulation that's really been driven by a couple of things. Local mandates to decarbonize, federal subsidies that have totaled over $200 billion over the last 10 years alone, that are now going to be another almost $400 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act, and ESG policies that are driving this underinvestment, a massive underinvestment in reliable generation. And so as we see more wind and solar coming onto the grid that are proving to be extremely unreliable in the cold temperatures that we've seen over the last week, you're seeing more rolling outages, something we're unfortunately too familiar with here in Texas, as we saw Winter Storm Uri in 2021 lead to hundreds of deaths. And that's going to be the case that we're seeing here in the United States over the last week.
And speaking of that blackout in history, are the problems with the grid just due to extreme cold, or what's happening here?
No, it's this extreme weather is nothing new. It's been happening for decades. But what's happening is really this underinvestment in reliable generation. Companies can't make near the profit because the market is being so distorted by subsidies from the federal government, and in some cases state levels are also doing subsidies and doing mandates as well. And so you have companies that just do not have the capital to invest in reliability, to invest in preparations for this type of weather. Unfortunately, they're having to invest in wind and solar to meet these ESG requirements coming in from financial institutions that are also part of the market manipulation. So we're being saddled with higher electricity costs, higher taxes, higher deficit at the federal level, and poor returns on environmental, social, and governance investing of our 401ks. And it's all coming out of our pockets, burdening Americans the most. And so that the least among us are just getting crushed with these higher electricity rates and higher tax burdens.
And with this transition into clean energy, renewable energy, how can we avoid problems with the grid in the future, especially as we transition more toward this clean energy?
Well, this is where the states really need to act, and something that we've been advocating for a number of years is to have reliability be the #1 factor for electric generation when you put electricity onto a grid. You've got to be able to meet demand when people need it the most. And remember that cold weather is much more dangerous than warm weather. We'll see a significant loss of life. I think over 30 deaths in Buffalo, New York alone reported because of the cold weather and power outages. You still have thousands of people without power today in New York. And New York's really one of these states that's leading this effort to decarbonize, which doesn't do anything to mitigate a changing climate. CO2 is necessary for life on Earth. It's not dirty. It doesn't have any taste or smell, which is interesting. exciting, but what we have done here in the United States is we've produced more natural gas, we've produced more oil, we've produced more coal, and we're world leaders in environmental protection. I think that's something that people don't understand, is that we've reduced harmful pollution 78% over the last 5 decades, and we're #1 when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water. So we need to embrace produced energy. It's here, produced here in the United States, and that's predominantly from fossil fuels and nuclear, that's affordable and reliable. And that's what we need to embrace and really unleash the American energy sector.
And expanding on that last part, what are the energy policies we should be seeing in America to make sure what happened doesn't happen again?
Yeah, well, one, you've got to push back on ESG at the state level because the federal government's just not going to do it. You've got to counter the federal subsidies that come into each and every state, and make sure that money goes into some sort of form of reliability, because it is so distorting the market. So state policymakers are ones that really have to lead here, and then put in reliability requirements. If you're going to have electricity on the grid, then people have got to be able to count on it. And so what that will mean is your wind and solar are going to have this firming reliability requirement, that they're going to have to build natural gas quick start generation. So when the wind stops blowing, they're still putting electricity on the grid. Those mostly foreign-owned companies are the ones that are benefiting from these subsidies that are coming from our federal government, and they should be ensuring reliability on our grid. So there's numerous policies that we have at lifepower.org. That we're working with multiple states across the country to ensure that we have reliable and affordable electricity for everyone.
And speaking of life-powered, how are we educating America's energy IQ? How does that work?
Well, we spend a lot of time with policymakers. We do extensive research, and then we make policy recommendations based on that research. And one way that we've pushed back here in Texas is we've told the largest financial institutions on the face of the earth that if you're going to boycott fossil fuels, then you're no longer welcome to do business with the state of Texas. And that model policy has been adopted in 4 additional states: West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Oklahoma are the others. And you've got incredible state financial officers around the country that are pushing back against these firms that are boycotting American fossil fuel producers while dumping money into Chinese companies that could care less about human rights or the environment. And that's where we push back. And so that's some one things that we do as Life Powered. We work with policymakers not only around the country, but also at the federal level and even the local level in some instances, to make sure that good policies are getting put in place that promote affordable, reliable energy, because access to affordable and reliable energy is the one thing that promotes human flourishing. And without it, it's very cold and it's very dark.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Anders Kaur, who's here to discuss the passing of the $1.7 trillion spending bill. Yes, $1 trillion. Join us after the break.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit. A battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
Freedom is not free, and neither is the truth. In order to bring you the facts, our reporters are out there on the front lines getting the true story. Some of them served 10 years of prison in China. We've been censored on social media. Our Hong Kong printing offices were set on fire, and we've been repeatedly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we continue to bring the truth to light. Head on over to getepoch.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
Welcome back. Let's turn to some good news. The government didn't shut down on December 23rd, but there's always a but. The bad news? To avoid a shutdown, the Senate passed a whopping $1.7 trillion, yes, trillion, omnibus spending bill on December 22nd. Before its passage, libertarian-leaning Republican Senator Rand Paul didn't hold back when he blasted his colleagues for wanting to spend that kind of money, saying it could spell ruin for the country.
But for expediting $1 trillion in deficit, I ran for office because I think we're destroying our country. We're going to destroy our currency. Why would I jump up and down and say, oh, well, let me please get out of the way so you can further bankrupt the country?
Now, before you assume our elected leaders wouldn't spend that kind of money recklessly, especially with inflation so high, you should know that senators didn't get the 4,155-page bill until late December 19th. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally could not read or comprehend a 4,000-plus page bill in just 2 days. And since its passage, some news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the National Review have criticized the spending bill as a steaming pile and a scandal. The New York Times even calling it sprawling. Joining us now to discuss this monster of a bill is Principal at Core Analytics, Anders Core. Anders, thanks for joining us. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
So you've criticized the passage of the omnibus spending bill as having little democratic accountability. Can you explain that?
Well, as you said, the bill was delivered to the Senate just a few days before they voted for it. It's absolutely not enough time for anyone to read over 4,000 pages of legislation. There's 12 spending bills wrapped up in one there. It's called an omnibus because all of the spending, and not only are they spending bills, but there's a lot of other legislation that's totally unrelated and stuffed in there. A lot of pork to pay off legislators, senators, congressmen to get their votes. They even increased defense spending by 10% in order to get some of the Republican votes. So this is the situation we're in. Fiscal responsibility is just being ignored essentially in order to get this massive spending bill in.
And Anders, before the bill's passage, we heard that Republicans wanted to pass a smaller bill and revisit spending when they took the House. But then 18 Republicans voted with the Democrats to pass this $1.7 trillion monstrosity. So what happened over there?
Well, we can only speculate, but I think that it may have had something to do in part with Ukraine. The moderate Republicans wanted to ensure that the budget was passed with a large increase to defense spending, including tens of billions of dollars for Ukraine. I think some of them thought that those numbers would not get passed by the incoming House, so they wanted to get it through before that switchover happened.
And now it seems when we talk about all of the spending, and also debt gets brought up a lot, and China owns the second largest amount of U.S. national debt. So is this a risk to national security and something we should be concerned about?
Well, certainly the building debt is a major risk to national security. At some point, our currency is going to be impacted. We already see inflation. All of this 1.7 trillion is inflationary spending on top of the inflation that we already have. And that debt will be out there. will have to be repaid. Eventually, that money will hit the streets again and increase inflation. So as far as China goes, you know, in a way, they're on the hook too. If they own that debt, what we can do potentially is refuse to honor that debt and selectively do that in terms of China. But the risk there also is that they could dump the debt on the market, which would decrease the value of our debt and increase interest rates even more than they are.
And Anders, when it comes to spending in recent years, not only have Democrats been spending more and more, but so have Republicans. So why do you think this is, and how can voters get Congress to rein in their spending?
Republicans are responding in some way to their constituents in terms of wanting a different type of spending by the federal government on average than Democrats. So Democrats tend to want more social service spending. Republicans tend to want more defense spending. Historically, Republicans have wanted fiscal restraint, but that's just not been the case recently. I mean, we do have major national security problems with China and Russia. We do need a strong Defense Department. We do need more spending, or we need to find new sources of revenue. For example, during the Trump administration, Poland offered to pay $2 billion for Fort Trump in Poland to defend it from Russia. We need to think outside the box in terms of how we get new funding for the Defense Department, or we encourage our allies in Europe and Asia to foot the bill for their own defense, which would allow us to decrease defense spending.
Well, Anders, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
And that's all from us here tonight on Newsmakers. We'll be back next Wednesday night with a brand new show. Until then, Happy New Year and have a good night. See you next year.